7NEWS7 with the drunken Jesuit, Bill Romansky.
Dr. Peterson, good to have you on the program.
Thank you very much.
With the popularity of your book and your YouTube lectures, you're obviously tapping into something that nobody else is tapping into at the moment. What is that?
It's partly responsibility. I don't think that people have talked to young people about responsibility in any real sense. And been on their side at the same time for like 50 years. And that's just too long because most people find the meaning in their life through responsibility.
Isn't it fair to say, though, that some people, through no fault of their own, have tough lives and that no matter how much personal responsibility they take, that won't change? So, for example,
yes.
You and I, we've had a lot of good fortune in our lives. We've been born to, reasonably affluent, peaceful countries. I have a job that I have worked hard at, but I've had lots of luck. You have written a book and done a series of lectures that have become embraced around the world. Some people don't get lucky breaks like
That's
that.
for sure. Some people just die, and horribly. Yeah, life's rough, no doubt about it. And if good luck comes your way, then you should be grateful for it. And if happiness manages to manifest itself, you should be grateful for that too.
But how do you give a personal responsibility message while taking account that for some people it's harder to take personal responsibility and the deck is stacked against them?
Well, I think the deck is stacked against everyone to some degree because life is very difficult and we all die. But some people do have it harder than others. And all of us have it very hard at some times in our lives. It's like, well, what's the alternative? You take responsibility for that and try to struggle uphill because the alternative makes everything worse. It's not like it's fair. I know perfectly well that people have brutal lives. I've been a psychotherapist for 20 years. I've seen things you can't imagine, horror shows that you can't fathom, and people who have been hurt in so many ways, so many dimensions. It's like, bitter? Should they be bitter? Should they be resentful? Should they become violent? These things don't help. They have to struggle uphill despite their excess burden. And it's responsibility, not guilt. It's not necessarily their fault. That's not the point.
We've been seeing a trend, particularly in the United States, but also here in Australia, where there has been an erosion of freedom of speech on campuses, where people with views that are considered offensive, politically incorrect or triggering are no longer
You mean
now...
people with views, in other words?
Certain views, more than others, tend to be not just the subject of protest, but those people will be, there'll be attempts to exclude them from speaking at campuses.
Yeah, I've noticed that.
What is going to be the effect if that kind of behaviour continues in those kinds of environments?
It's hard to tell. The broader social effect is not going to be good because lots of the things that are happening in the universities that aren't good are already leaking out into the broader social world. Part of what's going to happen is that people are going to stop coming and speaking on campuses. The comedians in the United States, many of them already they won't come and do their shows on campus because everybody's so sensitive to offense. But it also drives political polarization, which isn't a good thing unless you want to drive political polarization. And I think the universities are going to cut the branch off that they sit on.
Is being sensitive to offence such a problem, though? Like, we would have previously called that manners.
It's a terrible problem. So imagine okay, so the rule is you can't offend anyone, all right? Let's say you're speaking to one person, I can't offend you. All right, fair enough. What if I'm speaking to 10 people? Do I get to offend 1 in 10? How about 1 in 100? How about 1 in 1,000? You're going to come out on stage and you're going to say something important about something vital, and you're not going to offend 1 person in 1,000? Well, you can't say anything about anything important ever without offending probably the person you're talking to. Important speech about important issues, especially contentious issues, is instantly offensive.
But there are ways that you can share, I guess, provocative views where you attempt to still do that with an air of, say, respectfulness, where you're trying to mitigate against the offensiveness.
This is true, yeah. You can actually try listening when you're having a conversation, right? Assuming that both people who are having the conversation are of goodwill and they're not trying to play tricks and they're struggling towards the truth, which neither of them hold completely and both understand that. Yeah, you can reach across fairly large gaps and negotiate peace. Thank God for that, or we'd be at each other's throats all the time.
Well, say the example of there are some transgender people who want to not be referred to as he or she. They would prefer to be called Z or they. If somebody wants to be addressed like that, what does it cost me to do that?
It's hard to tell because the devil's always in the details. But as far as I'm concerned, that situation it's not relevant to the issues, for example, that I was involved in. I didn't care if transgender people wanted to be called by some pronouns, like whatever. That's something for individuals to negotiate. When the government makes that a compulsion and insists in their legislation that biological sex, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual proclivity vary independently, it's like, no, they don't. That's wrong factually, and you're not going to compel my speech. I don't care what your damn justification is.
So you see that as, am I right in that you see that as a curtailing of freedom?
It's worse than a curtailing of freedom. It's a demand that the population uses a certain kind of linguistic approach. It's an appropriation of speech. There's no excuse for that. That never has happened once in the history of English common law, right? It's a barrier that we do not cross. Hate speech laws are bad enough. It's not like there's no hate speech. Like anyone with any sense knows that there's hate speech. Who's going to regulate it? Who's going to define it? And I know the answer to that. The last people in the world you would want to. And then we cross another barrier and we allow the government to compel speech for some hypothetically compassionate reason? No way. That's a really bad idea.
Dr. Peterson, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks a lot for the invitation. Crazily radical in a conservative way. I don't know what to make of that.
Your teaching is crazily radical?
In a conservative way, yeah. I mean, it's in a conservative way because I think that the past is not only has value, we cannot live without the integration of the past. No more than you can live as an individual without integrating your past. I mean, we're historical creatures, right? And without, if we're not united consciously with the past, then we're divided internally and socially, and that has consequences. So some of them are playing themselves out in the political divisions in the current world. But the consequences can be fatal. So, you know, what's the saying? A house divided amongst itself cannot stand. Right, exactly. And the house is a very, very, to the degree that any symbol is universal, the house is a pretty universal symbol for the structure of the psyche. So, yeah.
And flowing on from that, it's interesting to hear you call it radical conservatism. Because there's a few quotes that I transcribed that from the Ideology, Logos and Belief lecture, which I remember having a kind of hairs stand up on the back of my neck moment when I heard you say this. I don't know what happens to a person if they bring themselves completely into alignment. I've had intimations of what that might mean. We don't understand the world very well. We don't understand how the world could be mastered if it was mastered completely. We don't know how an individual might manage that. We don't know what transformations that might make possible. That's mysticism rather than religion, is it not?
Well, I don't know if you can draw a distinction between those two things to some degree, because you could say that in a religious system there's two components, and people are temperamentally inclined to align with one or the other. There's a dogmatic component, so the conservatives are more likely to align with that, and there's a active mystical component, which updates the conservative component but also threatens it, so which is what creative thought does in general. And so I would say that the mystical element of that is religious, but it's more on the transformative side. But, you know, I also think that figures like the Buddha, you know, he's an exemplar of the possibilities of that alignment. And the exercises, the yogic exercises, for example, are attempts to bring that alignment into being. You know, I mean, it's very centered on the body, which is quite interesting, even though it's a spiritual tradition, right? It's very, very centered on the body. And I suppose that's related to the idea of the Christian idea, and the Jewish idea for that matter, but the Christian idea more particularly of the sacredness of the body, and also the Christian insistence that in the universal resurrection, the body will also be resurrected, right? It's not, and you know, people are cynical about that idea, but there's a, you know, because they think about it as simplistic and archaic and superstitious and all of that, and they're missing the point. The point is that that system doesn't denigrate the body. It says the body, there's something about the body that's integral to being and cannot merely be disposed of. And so if there's an eternality to existence, then it's an embodied eternality. And that's not, especially given what we know now about the manner in which intelligence operates is it's not really possible to have a disembodied being. It's not possible, really. So, yeah.
When you say you have intimations of what that might mean, can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I've had experiences where everything came together, you know, and they're very, very powerful experiences, and they're also characterized by, it's like everything turns into a musical symphony where each part is exactly appropriate for that moment. And I think music actually expresses that, which is partly why music produces transcendent experiences. You know, when people are dancing to something profound and they're really into it, let's say, the music and the person are the same thing. And then if things really get going, you see this sometimes in a rock concert or a musical concert where everyone is in the same place, right? The band kicks into high gear and they're way out beyond where they usually go. You don't see that often in a concert, even a great concert, but now and then you really see it. And the whole place is one thing. It's just pulsing, you know, and that's an amazing experience. And I think it is an intimation of paradise. It's something like that. And you can think about that psychologically, you know, because it also makes sense psychologically that your optimal experiences are going to occur when you're most united with yourself. But I don't know see, we don't exactly understand the relationship between our consciousness and the world. The materialistic notion is that everything is deterministically causal, essentially. It's a Newtonian view. It's also not true, but we know that it's factually not true. But apart from that, or it's, I shouldn't say that exactly, but at the very base of things, determinism isn't the operative mechanism. And I think things are too complex, actually, to be strictly determined. And it does look to me like we negotiate through that complexity. But when we're at our best, when we're integrated completely, and there's an effect of that integration in principle on what we would normally regard as external reality. Because external reality can line up with that integration as well, and so-called external reality. And I think people probably experience that when they have peak sexual experiences with someone, you know, where there's real intimacy because they're in the same place at the same time and everything comes together for that moment, you know.
Maybe literally.
Yes, literally, right. And I also don't think that linguistic usage is chance, right? Because I think that's a place where that experience is a brief intimation of heaven. That might be a way of thinking about it. So,
well, through listening to it, it started to make sense of a lot of what I've been doing over the last few years. I've done quite a lot of sort of deep transformational practices, a lot of shadow work, so integrating the shadow, and actually feeling that real sense of becoming more in alignment with myself, feeling that these different parts of myself coming together and feeling more embodied and more present in the world. But it was through listening to you that I made this connection with the Logos, with the idea that this is actually a deep principle of Western culture, which gave it another, a real
it's the
interesting
principle
perspective.
of the incarnation, right? Because the incarnation is at least a symbolic representation of the idea that the spirit has to fully inhabit the body, right? And that's also a remarkable idea, especially because the spirit, so to speak, the psyche, if you want, flees from the body in terror because the body is the place of mortality and suffering. And so people are disembodied, and it's because, one way of looking at it is because they're too afraid to become fully embodied. And it's no wonder they're afraid. There's reason to be afraid. But the question is, well, what would you be like if you had the courage to be fully embodied? And that's fully incarnate. That's another way of thinking about that. And the idea, the Christian idea, is that the fully incarnate human being is the Messiah. That's the idea. That's a hell of an idea, you know, but it means embracing the horrors of the world. That's what it means. And that's not only the horrors of the world, but the evil of the world, you know. So there's this idea that Christ took
the individual.
Absolutely. Well, then those are not different. And there's this idea that not only was Christ the incarnate spirit, right, so fully descended into the body, let's say, but that he also took the sins of the world onto himself. And what that means is that, psychologically speaking, is that part of spiritual development is to recognize the satanic tendencies that characterize you and to fully wrestle with them and to integrate them. That's the thing. It's not so much to cast them away. It's to transmute them. And you can see the difference between people who've done that and people who haven't, at least to some degree, because people who haven't integrated the shadow at all are naive. And you can tell that when you look at them, and you can tell that when you talk to them. And because they're naive, they're often resentful as well because they get taken advantage of. And someone who's integrated that more, they're dangerous in the martial arts sort of way, which is they're dangerous, but they don't have to use it because their presence radiates, what would you say? It doesn't radiate threat exactly. Well, certainly strength, but it's the potential for havoc. That's the right way of thinking about it. There's an implicit potential for havoc, and that's really necessary. It's one of the things that gives people self-respect. This is an interesting thing about the integration of the shadow, because recognizing yourself as the locus of evil, let's say, actually, in some sense, gives you far more respect for yourself, strangely enough, because the same respect that you might have for a wild animal or even a monster. It's like, so then maybe you learn to treat yourself differently. Like, I think this is particularly true with regards to the discipline of children. If you know that you're a monster and that will manifest itself in your life, consciously or unconsciously, and if it's unconsciously, it's not good, then you become better at disciplining children. And the reason for that is that you don't want to expose them to your dark side. And so if they behave and don't provoke you, which means they'll also behave for other people, then the monstrous part can stay in abeyance. And then that's great. But if you don't understand yourself as capable of wreaking havoc, and that can be the kind of havoc that unfolds over decades, right? Because if you're going to abuse a child, it's the primitive form of abuse is the physical abuse. The sophisticated form of abuse is the continual undermining of the child's courage across perhaps their entire life. And there's a terribly monstrous element to that. And if you're not respected properly by the child, say, you will absolutely take revenge on them. And, that's the whole, in some sense, that's the whole Freudian psychoanalytic story. It's not all of it, but it's a huge part of it. So,
interesting that you say that you have to accept the fact that you're dangerous or become dangerous, because I'd also say that if you haven't done that kind of shadow work, if you haven't made friends with your anger, if you haven't integrated it, you're actually more dangerous.
Yes, definitely.
Because then things will happen that it will come out in a way that you don't expect.
Right, it comes out disintegrated. So it comes out as an autonomous spirit, right, under no one's control. And that's like a burst of rage, let's say. When you hear about a mother who's done something terrible to one of her children, that's the reason, is that, maybe she's just been laid off, maybe she went out and had too much to drink, maybe she's hungover, she's angry and lonesome, and she's overwhelmed by the responsibility of the children, and she has a child who's testing, and she doesn't know how to limit it. And one day, the child tests at exactly the wrong time, and it's like mayhem. And everybody goes, well, what happened? It's like, well, 7 terrible things came together at the same time and produced this outburst of disintegrated rage. And like, look the hell out when that happens, So, yeah, you want to have that. You either have that or it has you. Those are the options. And you don't become safe by being castrated, right? That's not the right move forward.
And it almost feels like, having done that, I feel that as a physiological thing.
Mm-hmm. It is a physiological.
There's more tools at my disposal.
Exactly, it is a physiological thing. I mean, you can actually see a change in people's faces when that part of them is integrated, when I would say the rage circuit is integrated, because their faces harden. Like they no longer look like wide-eyed children, that they're no longer someone to whom things only happen. They're someone who makes things happen. And there isn't much difference between being dangerous and being indomitable, right? They're the same thing looked at from two different perspectives. And so, you know, in my new book, I wrote a little bit about, there was an idea in the 80s that was reasonably popular among psychologists, that the way to regulate male aggression was to socialize little boys like little girls. And that's a very, very bad idea. So, because suppressing that aggressive, competitive urge, which also characterizes many women, by the way, although it's more common among men, that isn't what you do. You integrate it. This is why I'm such a fan of Piaget, you know, not as opposed to Freud, but I think Piaget's developmental model is superior to Freud's developmental model, because for Piaget, the process of becoming civilized is a process of continual integration, including the integration of what Freud would consider the id. You know, I mean, it's not as if Freud didn't know that, because he wanted people to incorporate the id, but he kind of conceptualized socialization as the superego inhibiting the id, you know, or suppressing it. That only happens when the socialization process is bad. When it's good, like if you have a competitive child, like my son was and is a competitive person, you have them integrate that into the ethos of fair play, and then it's a mark of character strength at that point. Absolutely, there's no doubt about it.
Would you also say that has to be balanced with compassion, with a greater sort of openness as well at the same time?
Well, it has to be aimed, right? You need an aim, and to put your integrated capabilities to work at bringing everything together is the right aim. And it's not a task for, you know, one of the things about, I think, and one of the things about the way morality is taught is it's always taught like it's always taught as if it's your grandma and her corset is too tight. You know, it's a hectoring sort of thing, that you should be good, and the reason that you should be good is kind of for other people, you know, and so it's
almost like the Freudian sense you talked about.
Yeah, that's the superego sense. Exactly, that's right, and that it's a bunch of restrictions on you, and so you have to reduce yourself in order to be a good person, and that's, well, you might say that that's a prerequisite to discipline, because I think in some sense it is, you know, that you do have to be molded and shaped. You know, Nietzsche believed that a long period of unfreedom had to precede a period of freedom, and that's something like discipline. But fundamentally, that's not the proper orientation, because making everything work better is actually the most demanding task that you can take on. And it's not a matter of reducing yourself to a domesticated moral being, you know, like a fat pug dog, something like that, you know. It's a task that takes everything that you've got, and so you can use all of those darker forces, let's say, to be indomitable as you move forward, and you want a challenge, because all of those forces are exactly the thing that is there for the challenge, and so it becomes a matter of, well, it's a conversion of something that can be very dark into something that's a prerequisite for light. So
I was thinking this on the plane, linking to the thing I said before about how connecting this personal growth to the idea of the logos was really powerful, and reframing this, and I've heard you speak about this in a certain way as almost like a heroic mission. Mm-hmm. That you take on ultimate responsibility for your words, you take on responsibility for moving the world either closer or further from chaos. That this is a
you take on responsibility for moving the world closer to heaven or hell.
And this, I was thinking how powerful a doctrine of, I've always thought, I've made a few documentaries about ISIS, before, and how seductive a worldview that is.
Right.
You can either be a shelf stacker in Wolverhampton,
Exactly.
or you're on the front line fighting for your culture in an existential conflict for the future of the world.
Right.
So what I find powerful, and I only really thought this the last few days, is your message almost allows you to reframe your own life in that same heroic way. And it feels like something like that is essential.
It is essential
for us to fight back against those kind of ideologies.
There's no doubt about that, and it's for the reason that you just laid out. It's like you take a tough 17-year-old kid, who's rebellious enough not to fit well into the extra domesticated school systems that we impose on our children. Most of my friends, because I lived in a working class town, most of my friends dropped out of school before grade 10. And I wouldn't say it was the least admirable kids who dropped out. These were guys who pretty much physically matured at 15 or 16. Some of them were pretty big and strong. And they were done with putting up their hand to go to the bathroom. They were just done with that. And the fact that they left school, it was a bad long-term decision, maybe, for many of them. I mean, a lot of them went and worked on the oil rigs and made a fortune, but they never kept any of it. But they didn't drop out of school only for weakness and failure, And so there has to be a challenge put forward to those people who are inclined in that aggressive competitive direction, or they will fall prey to, well, you mentioned that, why would people go fight for ISIS? Well, you just said why. And you can't really understand that unless you can allow yourself to imagine how you could be attracted to that. And the shelf stacker versus the heroic desert warrior, I mean, it's an illusion. And it's a dangerous one. And it's being utilized in a very manipulative manner by the people who are pushing this. But you always have to give the devil his due.
And do you think we need a heroic story of our own to combat it?
Well, what do you have otherwise? You have a life of pleasure seeking. You have no admiration for yourself if you live a life like that, right? There's contempt, there's self-contempt that's going to build. Or engagement in things at a trivial level, which isn't useful, because in the final analysis, whatever your life is, it's not trivial. The suffering makes it not trivial as a baseline. You're stuck with a certain number of profound experiences, and all of them can be negative if you don't. All of them can be negative if you let the default manifest itself. But you don't get trivial, because you have to encounter your own death and the death of everyone around you and the horrors of the world. And so there's no trivial response that doesn't subject you to that with no defense and then embitter you. So yeah, there's a call to nobility in the idea of imitation of the Logos. But it's more than that. It's a call to something of, well, the hypothesis is it's a call to something of cosmic significance. And I don't think that we have any right to assume that that idea is wrong. We don't understand our place in the cosmos. And, if you base your analysis on size, physical size, well, there are bigger things than us. But that's not a reasonable yardstick. There isn't anything that's more complex than us, not that we know of. So why not use that as a marker? And there is something. There's an integral relationship between consciousness and being, and that isn't taken with sufficient seriousness by the materialist community. They keep, like people like Daniel Dennett, for example, and he wrote a book on consciousness, which his critics, it was called Explaining Consciousness, and his critics called it Explaining Consciousness Away. And I read the book, and that is what he did as far as I'm concerned. And, people like Sam Harris have a real hard time with free will, and so their proclivity is to deny it. But they act out the proposition that people have free will, including themselves, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to exist in society, because people aren't very happy when you treat them like they're not at least semi-autonomous agents. And so I don't think that that's fluke. I think that we are semi-autonomous agents. Now, we don't understand how that can be possible, but I'm not willing to say that it isn't the case merely because I can't explain it, especially when I observe that people accept it behaviorally as an axiomatic proposition. So they accept it as true. They can say they don't believe it, but it doesn't matter. Well, it depends on what you think you mean when you say believe. And for me, you act out what you believe, you know, and your conscious, your cognitive, your capacity for abstraction can divorce itself from your embodied reality and go wherever it wants. It can even propose contradictory. It can propose a worldview that isn't in alignment with the manner of your embodiment at all. That happens all the time. It happens to everyone to some degree because we're not transparent to ourselves. But well, it isn't so straightforward to determine what our place is in the world. And the thing that really got me with regards to that wasn't the good that we could do, but the harm that we can do. Because you can debate about the good we can do, but you cannot debate about the harm we can do. That's done. We know, if we want to know. Yeah. And I think my experience was when I took that seriously, which meant understanding how that was about me, you know, about that Auschwitz was about me, and that the Stalinist camps were about me, then, well, that reorients you. That's a deep part of the shadow idea, right? I mean, and I think that is part of the idea of taking the sins of the world onto yourself. It's like you're a human being, so you see what human beings do. That's you. And you might say, well, I'd never do that. It's like, don't be so sure about that. In fact, the probability that you're wrong is extraordinarily high. Especially if you think you wouldn't. Well, that's yes. And I mean, it isn't self-evident that the default position is heroism in the face of the advance of evil. In fact, quite the contrary. So it's highly probable that you would be on the side of the weak who are transformed into oppressors. And that's a very terrifying realization if you take it seriously, which you should. And I do believe that if we don't take that with sufficient seriousness, we are not going to survive because we're too powerful to be naive. You know, and that was something that Jung insisted on, especially after the invention of the hydrogen bomb in particular. It's like, if you're going to play with fire, you better be a master of fire.
What are the prerequisites for true knowledge and understanding? Because it seems to me that intelligence is only a small matter of seeing and understanding properly, and it takes a certain amount of moral courage. It takes a certain amount of having done the work of introspection, having done the work of deep introspection. What do you think the components are for true knowledge and understanding? Well,
I think the motivation, one of the best motivations, is existential terror. You know, I mean, I don't remember where this is in the Old Testament, but the line is, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And that's definitely psychologically true, but we could strip it, say, of its transcendent implications and say, well, if, for me anyways, I wasn't motivated to be serious until I knew what I was capable of in the most negative way. Because you don't take yourself seriously until you know that you are an evil monster. And you don't take that seriously until you know what that means. And so, but once you know what that means, especially if you do it, if you find that out consciously, say, then you're in a position to start taking yourself seriously enough so that you might be willing to Learn what you need to learn to become wise. You have to see yourself as an Auschwitz camp guard, and you have to see yourself enjoying it. And that can't just be an exercise in intellectual simulation, precisely. It has to be a dramatic experience. You have to feel that in your bones. And then you have to decide, and you have to give the devil his due. There's something very attractive about predatory power. And you might even say that it's preferable to pathetic weakness. Now, I'm not saying that, but you could make a case that it is. Because you could say that the person who's pathetically weak would like to be a predatory tyrant, but just doesn't have the ability. And that's a Nietzschean criticism of standard morality, I would say. But then, is there something higher than predatory power? Well, yes. I mean, part of Christ's encounter with Satan in the desert is precisely that realization, because he's offered the kingdom of the world. And that means he's offered the option of tyrannical power. And his response to that is, there's something better. And that's wisdom. There is something better. And there's no reason not to go for what is the best. What else? You don't have anything better to do than that by definition, right? So why not work for the betterment of being and abandon your resentment and your hatred of humanity and your self-contempt and take on the responsibility of the horrors and catastrophes of human existence, and do what you can to, well, at least not make it worse, but maybe to make it better. You know you can. You know you can make it worse and better. You just don't know how much. Find out. It might be way more than you think. I'm sure that's the case. So there isn't any more interesting adventure than that. You know, find out how much good you can do in the world. And not in this moralistic thou shalt not way, but in a